it's a tough one. But at least on the academic front, there were some interesting papers written by Michael Kramer from Harvard on something called odious debt, which is basically, so far we assume that if a government issues bonds, well, they have to pay them back. Except what he argues, which is an interesting point, is what happens if a government issues bonds and then they just steal the money or misuse it. Should they really pay it back? And well, there's ample evidence that this has happened, right? And there's a case to be made that this debt should be repudiated and not paid. And it's been discussed in the literature. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot that has been done in the real world for a long time, but it's a tough one.
Next question.
Considering that the major issues for the G20 seem to be trade and global warming, and also that even if they somehow could come to an agreement, all of them, it's not actually going to be implemented unless there's something in it for each of those respective countries. What are some opportunities to create buy-in from India and China to curb their global emissions, or create, reasons for them to do that in terms of trade-offs with Western countries? In other words, what are some opportunities that each of you panelists see for creating opportunities to create value for each of the countries within the G20?
Yeah. So maybe I can address this question somewhat narrowly with respect to the climate change issue. Because it's, it is something that I feel passionately about, and yet I can also understand, at least to some extent, the position taken by India and China. So, the first point to make is that Mother Nature doesn't really care whether the molecule of carbon dioxide is coming out of the tailpipe of Arnold Schwarzenegger's Hummer, or whether it's being emitted by a poor farmer in India. I mean, it has the same impact on the world's climate system. And while the developed countries as a group still emit more carbon dioxide than the developing countries as a group, those lines are going to cross. And they're going to cross within a few years. And from that point on, the developing countries as a group will be adding more to the stock of carbon dioxide than the developed countries. So, they've got to participate in policies to combat climate change. But the second inconvenient truth about global warming is that once a carbon dioxide molecule is emitted, it can stay resident in the atmosphere for a very long time. It's at least statistically possible that some of the CO2 emitted by James Watt's first steam engine, right, is still up there in the atmosphere. So when you look not at the flow of new carbon emissions, but the stock of carbon dioxide currently in the atmosphere that's changing the climate, that's mostly coming from the developed countries. And when India and China hear the West saying to them, you've got to take responsibility for these flows, they turn around and say, you've got to take responsibility for the stock. So what do we do? Right? I think it's going to be very difficult to find a way forward unless the industrial West does take some responsibility for its stock. I mean, the way that this has worked in the U.S. domestic context is the EPA Superfund. Right? People who have emitted poisonous stuff in the past without realizing that it was poisonous pay something into a fund that's designed to compensate the people who suffer from the stock and also prevent further emissions. So some kind of global super fund could be part of a deal. Another part of the deal could be generous credits in a U.S. carbon control system for offsets from places like China and India, basically paying Indian or Chinese firms to reduce CO2 emissions instead of rewarding U.S. firms for doing it. But at the end of the day, we probably aren't going to be able to rely solely on carrots to seal this deal. We probably also need sticks, right? So while I think that carbon tariffs should be off the table for now, I do not necessarily agree that they should be off the table indefinitely. And at some point, if India and China and other large developing country emitters are completely unwilling to engage, even with the presence of a super fund and, substantial offset credits, then yeah, we need to talk about some kind of enforcement mechanism. It's going to be a very tough nut to crack.
Sure,
Just
please.
to follow up on Lee's point, that enforcement mechanism, by putting a tariff up, would essentially, I know you know this, would essentially make all of us pay some amount per good we would have had to pay a higher price for to enforce those. So we'd have to have a debate in the United States. How much are we all willing to pay per some time period to put a credible enforcement mechanism in place? I think that's a very interesting question, and I think we ought to at some point have a national discussion about that.
I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions.
Good evening. My name's Jared Halls. I'm a graduate student at Hayes College. My question is for the gentleman from San Francisco. You mentioned that it's difficult to detect bubbles inside the market. At the beginning of the year, many experts were predicting that the credit card consumer market was going to be the next bubble to burst. And then I believe last week there were reports out that about $21 billion was paid back in credit card money. So do you feel that they were a little preemptive in predicting that the credit card market would be the next to go, or do you feel that the risk is still out there for it to happen?
Well, that's a very good question. There are 2 areas which, at least in the U.S., you could point out as being problematic. One is the consumer debt, for sure. So there are very good models which map the relationship between unemployment and consumer debt, and the default on consumer debt. So we can safely say that it's going to continue for a while, and it's going to rise. Whether it's a bubble or not, I'm not sure. It's certainly a problem. The mortgages were a lot bigger. Without saying that, I'm not saying that this is not a problem. It is a problem, but the mortgages were a lot bigger. So it is an issue. The other one, which is still out there, is commercial real estate, where basically mortgages on the consumer side, on the residential side, have been marked down. Basically, if you imagine there's a building with 100 apartments and 1 defaults, and it sells for half of what it used to be, you can say, well, maybe the whole building, each apartment is worth half. But if someone owns a mall and says, well, you know, the other mall defaulted, but it's a different mall than mine, it's different, and as long as there's no trading, the banks tend not to mark this down. So that is still a big one out there, and again, I'm not sure it's a bubble or not, but it's a problem which is clearly present. Those are the 2 ones that I would monitor, but I think it's fairly understood that they're there.
Last question.